I'm Jonathan Wilson. I'm one of the co-founders of the FinCEN Report Company, and welcome to the FinCEN Report podcast. We have a very special guest today. His name is Jim Lee. He is the chief of the Criminal Investigative Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Now, as many of you know, beginning in 2024, more than 30 million U.S. companies are going to file beneficial ownership reports with FinCEN under the Corporate Transparency Act. The purpose of that law is to fight money laundering, and Mr. Lee, through the Criminal Investigative Division, is one of the chief law enforcement officers in the U.S. with the responsibility for fighting money laundering and tax evasion. So we're going to be talking to him about his plans for the Corporate Transparency Act, how the Criminal Investigative Division works, and everything else that comes in between. So sit back and relax and listen to this conversation. So Jim Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you joining us on the podcast. Now, our audience is a general business audience, and hopefully most of them have not encountered the IRS Criminal Investigative Division before. But if you would, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about the CI division and what is your mission?
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate the invitation, and hopefully a lot of your listeners haven't dealt with us before, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I appreciate the invitation because I've spent my entire adult career here with IRS CI, 28 years now. And for the last 3 years, I've actually served as our chief. So, in this position, again, a lot of this is for your listeners that maybe have never dealt with an IRS CI special agent before. And I oversee a worldwide staff of about 3,100 employees across all disciplines. That includes about 2,100 special agents, our officers. They're posted in about 20 offices around the country, and we're actually in 11 foreign countries as well. So I lead and oversee some of the most significant investigations of financial crimes. And there's a wide gamut of financial crimes: tax, money laundering, public corruption, cyber, ID theft, narcotics, the list goes on. Mm-hmm. So a little bit of background for those that have never interacted with a special agent. I like to start off discussions like this to give some context for those that don't know about us. I'm going to brag a little bit, about the division where I've spent my entire adult career. So fiscal year 22 is what I'm going to focus on. For some context, the division identified $32 billion in tax fraud and other financial crimes. Okay, that's 3 times what we did, the year before. It's a big number.
When you say identified, what does identify mean?
When we work an investigation and write up a prosecution report and refer it over to the Department of Justice as a prosecution recommendation, it's what we identify as fraud. I'd suspect the number would be bigger, but we send over as a recommendation what we can prove.
Sure. So that's what you think you can prove. Gotcha.
That's what we identify. Mm-hmm. Sticking with the fiscal year 22 theme, Jonathan, we seized digital data, almost 3 petabytes of information. That's about 2.5 times what we seized the year before. Mm-hmm. And for context for your listeners out there, not to insult anybody's intelligence, but there's 1,000 terabytes in a petabyte. And there's a lot of ways to, unravel that or compare that to something. But the one that I like to use is there's 10 terabytes of data in the printed collection of the Library of Congress. So we seized about 300 printed Libraries of Congress worth of data. if you think of it like that. And that's just digital data seized. Okay, that's not talking about paper records. Okay. Yes. The division in fiscal year 22, we've continued our, kind of cyber approach, in the digital asset space. And we had $7 billion in crypto and value in crypto seized. Again, that leads government. It's a big number. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, maybe if we have time. And then, of course, probably my biggest, any special agent from IRSCI that you talk to, probably the thing that all of us are most proud of is a conviction rate of about 90%, north of 90%. It leads law enforcement, federal law enforcement, pretty much year in and year out. And I like to say that because it simply means that if you get in the crosshairs of an IRSCI special agent, it's highly likely you're going to go to jail. So again, that's just some highlights. Our mission, again, not to insult anybody's intelligence, but just to ensure that people know where I'm coming from here, is to investigate tax crimes. That is my priority, okay? But we also investigate a number of other financial crimes. And I named a couple of: money laundering, bank secrecy, terrorist financing, national security, narcotics. Spend a significant amount of time there. But tax is the highest priority. And there's a reason for that. CI, I work for the Internal Revenue Service, right? So one of the many spokes, and one of the things I like to say why we're relevant within the service, is because we got to make sure, part of our role is to make sure that the hard-working, honest American tax-paying citizens, the overwhelming majority of us, know there's a consequence for being willfully non-compliant. And that consequence is jail time, far different than paying a fine, right? So we're the only agency that can recommend federal tax violations, and we're the only federal aid law enforcement agency that spends 100% of our time on financial investigation. So it makes us unique and really protectors of the overall integrity of the financial system. And something else I like to say, when we talk about money laundering and tax evasion, money laundering is tax evasion in progress, right? And so if you think,
I was about to use that quote.
yeah, I say it all the time.
You said that before, yes.
If you think about it, other than random acts of violence, it's pretty hard to think of a crime that's committed for a reason other than to make money. So we can get involved in all of them. We work day in and day out with our local, county, state, federal partners, domestically and internationally, unraveling these complex transactions. And your audience knows some of these historical notable cases like Al Capone, John Gotti, FIFA, believe it or not, started as a tax case. Facets of the Sinaloa cartel, Silk Road, Alpha Bay, the college admissions scandal, Varsity Blues got a lot of publicity, historically. That list goes on. But just in the past year, our agency either led or co-led the Hydra investigation. Okay, this was the largest darknet marketplace takedown in the history of U.S. government. The AG did a press conference on that. And that was a marketplace that predominantly sold narcotics. Sold a lot of stuff, predominantly narcotics. Also, this past year, in fiscal year 22, the Bitfinex hack. Deputy AG did a press conference. That was the largest single financial seizure in the history of government. It was about $3.6 billion in value in crypto. And then another, the one that held the record was just a couple months prior to that. It was just under seal for a while, and that was the Silk Road seizure, and that was about $3.4 billion in value. So numerous more just like this. I'm honored to serve as the chief and be surrounded by, all the talent, that I have. But I mentioned a number of the priorities and the financial cases, but think international fraud, abusive tax crimes, cyber, ID theft, pure money laundering, COVID, sanctions. So I think the reason that when I talk about deterrence and being in the IRS and the relevance, revolve around providing confidence in the tax system. If you think about it, IRS, we're responsible, the enterprise, for the nation tax system. We collect about $4 trillion in tax revenue each year. That's about 96% of what funds government. So think military, roads, bridges, infrastructure. Okay, so therefore, deterrence is a critical part, and that's why we're relevant within the service.
Exactly. The government can't run without revenues, and you make sure that everyone stays honest with the way they report their taxes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So for our audience, focused as we are on the Corporate Transparency Act, we're all looking forward to a world in which reporting companies on the CTA are filling out their beneficial ownership reports, and FinCEN has this big database of beneficial owners. And one of the questions I often get, mostly from other lawyers, is how is government, meaning you and FinCEN and the others in federal government who will have access to the BOI data, how are they going to use that data to pursue money laundering. Is that something that you're able to speak to today?
Yeah, I can speak to, if you let me unpack that for a minute, it's a great question, Jonathan. And, as your audience knows, IRS and FinCEN are both bureaus within the Treasury Department. They gather all the BSA filings. They're going to be gathering those new or BOI, beneficial ownership forms here at some point, correct? And it's critical because, like I said, we spend 100% of our time on financial investigations. So we partner with FinCEN incredibly close. And if I can just take one sidestep and I'll get to your BOA filings, because
Sure.
I'd like to just maybe talk about BSA data just real quick in general. All of it, BSA filings, I've said this numerous times, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have in an effort to identify individuals that attempt to commit financial crimes, tax or other. And, AML specialists in the financial institutions are really the first line of defense to detect these illegal or suspicious activities. Mm-hmm. And, knowing your audience and what you're doing, I feel you and your audience will agree with me here. Certainly the financial institutions will. I've always felt, or I felt strong about, so I'm passionate about it, in fact, trying to be able to quantify the importance here of that data, was so important, that I challenged a team here within CI, led by one of our special agents in charge in a public-private partnership setting, to flush out some of these quantitative metrics that I have. It's just not necessarily organized to give you feedback, but I have the information. It's just got to put a little weight and energy behind it to make it mean something, so you can tell a story and give some of that feedback that the financial institutions are so desperately seeking. And that's exactly what this team did. They took a first of its kind look at how we're incredibly large users of BSA data and how we use it. And we came up with some measurements. I've got multiple phases. So I just want to just give you a couple of those stats, and then I'll get into the BOI stuff. Sure. When I say BSA filings, I mean all of them. 8,300 CMIR reports, CTRs, casino reports, FBARs, all BSARs, everything, right? So I'm not honing in on any one form, but why this is significant, just to give your audience a feel. Told you we're financial investigators, right? So about 15.8, 16%, let's call it, of all my new initiations in fiscal year 22 were a direct result of a BSA filing. Okay, that's a huge percentage of my new inventory. Okay, that's just my brand new inventory. 16% came from BSA data. This demonstrates my comment about it's a must have. And it's important to note because, again, I work for an enterprise that, is somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people, right? And we get fraud referrals. That only accounts for about 5% of my inventory, just to give you some context of where our inventory is coming from.
Right.
Another pretty important stat that I like to bring up is about, these are approximates. About 84% of all of our investigations open, of all new inventory in fiscal year 22, had a BSA filing associated with the primary target.
Right.
So that includes all violations, okay, not just tax. And it's interesting.
So BSA data touches 84% of all of your active cases.
That's right. And something in a later phase, I want to know, 15%, 16% are a direct source, 84% of everything has it. So what am I missing? Am I not looking at that data correctly? I'm obviously BSA data is important. It's touching every target I have practically, but why isn't more being directly sourced? And that's a later kind of iteration. And I think the last comment, the last stat I'll give to you, and then maybe I'll try to answer your question about the BOI information, sir. There's another stat and just another data set about, on average, over the last 3 fiscal years, I'm just making sure I have this right, about 83% on average of the targets that we recommended for prosecution over the last 3 fiscal years had a BSA filing associated with them. Just another way to look at it. That's all. And I did that as an average because if you drill down on that data set, those 83% of targets over the last 3 years that we recommend for prosecution, about 40 of them have been 40% of them have been adjudicated through the entire judicial process. Okay. And of that data set that have been all the way through sentencing, average sentence is about 38 months, about 225 million in asset forfeiture, about 256 million in restitution ordered, and then about 7.7 billion in asset seizure amount. Now, a lot of that is that value of those crypto seizures I told you, but nevertheless, it's a big number.
It's a big number.
And again, just demonstrating how important AML compliance and BSA filings are to my division. And I really can speak on behalf of all law enforcement.
Absolutely.
Because when we all use it, we're all financial investigators. We just do it 100% of the time. So now I think your question was, and I guess I can get back to it, is, how do we expect to use beneficial ownership information? I think is what
exactly. For example, just brainstorming with someone one day, I said, well, wouldn't it be interesting if you could take all of the companies that filed a BOI report, sort them by EIN, then pull their tax returns and compare the beneficial owners against the owners they identify in their Schedule K-1s and look for variances and simply follow up on the ones where there seem to be unexplained variances. Would that be a technique you might use, or am I too far out of the box?
I suppose maybe I should think about hiring you for a job. No, I
just want 10%, Jim, is all.
No, these data sets are, critical. And that could be, yes, that could be one. There's a lot of different techniques and, looking at the data and how it's going to help us. As your audience probably knows, our government's inability to mandate the collection of beneficial ownership information, corporate entities being formed, that's been a vulnerability, I think, in the financial system. It's some countries do it better than others, but it's definitely a vulnerability. I think often in financial investigations, beneficial ownership is only identified after subpoenas are issued or witnesses are interviewed, or maybe surveillance or search warrants. We got to go international. Legal treaties and legal treaties. The process of that sometimes takes some time, and that can take weeks, months, maybe even years sometimes when you're seeking information abroad. And then once you go through that process, the financial investigator may only discover that the owner of one corporate entity is just another corporate entity. You got to start the process all over again. So, I guess requiring the beneficial ownership information by legal entities and the creation of this database that's available to, law enforcement, regulators, I suspect. I'll speak on behalf of law enforcement here, though. It's just going to result in efficiency to start with, which is huge, in identifying these beneficial owners. And it's significant because then I can take those resources and apply them somewhere else, opposed to running that down, right? That's a huge piece of it. And
right.
Increased corporate transparency is going to make it difficult for criminals to disguise business ownership, whether it's evading taxes, concealing assets, or disguising their involvement in some other illicit activity. So there's a lot of benefits for law enforcement.
Absolutely. In addition to just identifying perpetrators, I imagine having the ability to know the beneficial ownership of a company and its related bank accounts would give you an enhanced ability to seize those assets before the perpetrators have the ability to abscond with that value, or before they can be tipped off by a friendly banker or something like that.
Yeah, no, you got it. In addition, that information, when you think about, will it make a difference for law enforcement? The true criminals or fraudsters and co-conspirators involved in the schemes can be identified. The source or use of illicit funds can be identified. The true recipients of taxable income, understanding that money laundering is tax evasion in progress. Those illicit proceeds are all taxable. You just mentioned the seizure and the forfeiture, true owners of those accounts. Other business relationships, when I think of those I-2 charts, and you can kind of start to see everything, come together. Evidence of intent, say, there's use of nominees like family members, just to name a few, will aid significantly in efficiency.
That's right. And I'm curious, there's been so much talk about artificial intelligence in the news. I'm curious whether your division has explored the use of artificial intelligence in taking these massive data sets and looking for patterns, similarities, triggers that would lead to a suspicion that there might be something going on. In addition to comparing beneficial ownership against Schedule K1, for example, you could look at entities that report no revenues and yet have large bank account balances, other things like that. Is that something that has ever been put on the table for further discussion?
Yeah, it has actually, Jonathan. You touch it. I kind of run them in two different paths here. We've really, within IRS CI, we embrace data. We've really become a data-centric agency. Because I mentioned I got 3,100, personnel across all disciplines, about 2,100 officers. We have to get involved in the biggest and baddest cases that are going to create an impact. I can't investigate my way out of any particular program, right? So we've been using data. I would say we've really become a data-centric agency over the past, 3 to 5 years, and we're just getting better at it. That's one lane. Now, when you talk about the AI lane, that's another piece of technology, that you could be used, to help make the data make sense. There's other tools too. But what that takes is significant, investment and governance. And, there's some legal issues that we've got to consider. So I think I would round it off to say we're using data, yes, and we're making those comparisons using tools that you mentioned earlier. I'm not the technology expert here, but what I do know of AI, I suspect if legally we're able to use that type of technology or that type of a tool to help us, with our analysis of data sets, of course it's going to make us more efficient. So I'd probably leave it at that, but I kind of see it two different ways because there's lots of technology out there that'll help us.
Absolutely. And in the end, you're just looking at data, and AI is just one other tool in your tool belt for manipulating and parsing that data.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
So at this point, a large segment of the U.S. business community is still not really well informed about the Corporate Transparency Act and all the work that they're going to have to do beginning on January 1, 2024. What message would you have to the business community as it relates to getting ready to file that first beneficial ownership report and things that they ought to be keeping in mind?
Yeah, I know I know this is clearly challenging for a lot of reasons with the institutions and regulators, and maybe I'll answer that by thinking about why it's important. Maybe I'll go down that road. So because I know it's challenging, I would suggest strongly, first, the lack of transparency, allows criminals, corrupt officials, other bad actors, you name the illicit crime, to hide their identities and launder illicit funds through using shell companies or front companies. And this in turn hurts Americans because of the lack of transparency, often resulting in an uneven playing field, for legitimate U.S. businesses, right? I believe that's a FinCEN frequently asked question. Second, I think, legitimate businesses who play by the rules that are not involved in illegal activity, and paying their fair share of taxes, by the way, should welcome these regulations and seek to limit the use of shell companies, by criminals who are laundering illicit proceeds, financing terrorism, avoiding sanctions, evading taxes, I got to say, and the list goes on there. And then I think, in addition, by collecting this information, sharing it with law enforcement and, other authorized users, it's going to make it harder for bad actors to hide or benefit from those gains. And companies that report this BOI information, are contributing to that important goal. So I think every corporation, has a shared interest in ensuring the stability of the U.S. financial system. Weaknesses and vulnerabilities there really encourage fraud, which makes banks and other, critical, financial institutions susceptible to losses, causing chaos for everybody. So I think it's more of encouragement of, because I know it's challenging, and I know there's risks and there's regulators, and I know it's expensive, but I would just look at it on that side, just some encouraging factors of why it's important to law enforcement and why it should be important to those entities.
Sure. We couldn't agree more. At the FinCEN Report Company, we exist to help companies get their beneficial reports filed. So I understand that completely. Well, Mr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. We really have appreciated your insights into the Corporate Transparency Act and how you're going to be looking at these cases. Any final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, other than, because, we talked a lot about BSA filings, I just like to say, maybe I'll leave you with this. It's critical. We a lot of this is public-private partnerships too, right? And we as a division, as my law enforcement partners, are all in on public-private partnerships. But I'm going to talk about us just real quick. Around the globe, and we have to have these public-private partnerships to keep pace with the fraudsters that are trying to take advantage of people. So we're fully embracing public-private partnership. And we understand that law enforcement can't do it alone. To be successful, you got to have these PPPs. We all know it. So the more we embrace it and devote time and resources to cultivating, maintaining, strengthening those partnerships, the more successful we'll all be. And I always like to say, kind of in closing, this is a globally connected world. So we can't afford not to work together in a PPP setting if we want to have an impact on people committing these financial crimes and manipulating the system. So global problems require global solutions. When we can work together, we make it a lot smaller. We make the space a lot smaller for criminals to actually operate in. So, Jonathan, again, I just want to thank you for having me and appreciate the time we got to spend here.
We appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for your thoughts, and we look forward to continuing this compliance journey together.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.